My name is Evelyn May Carter. Most folks around here just call me Miss Evelyn, or sometimes Nana May. I'm 79 years old, born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, though these days I live a little further north, in a quiet brick house on the edge of town. The street is lined with oak trees, whose roots have cracked the sidewalks, and when the summer comes, the air smells of cut grass and fried catfish from the corner cafe. I'm not a famous woman. I never wrote a book or stood on a stage, and I surely never thought my life would be something worth telling to strangers on the internet. But after all these years, after all the storms I walked through, I've come to believe that every story matters, especially the stories of women like me. Black women who carried generations on their backs, who kept walking when the world told us to sit down, who loved when there was no reason left to love. So tonight, I want to sit with you, almost like we're on the front porch together. Picture me in my old rocking chair with my hands folded over this lap blanket I sewed myself. I'll speak slow, because at my age, rushing doesn't do anyone any good. And I'll tell you my story. Not polished, not pretty all the way through, but true. I was born in 1946, the second child of Ruth Ann and Clarence Carter. My daddy worked long hours in the steel mills, his skin always smelling of smoke and iron when he came home. My mama scrubbed floors in the houses of white families who never once called her by her name. They said girl or maid, and she answered, because what choice did she have? But every night, no matter how tired, she sang hymns while she cooked cornbread, and she braided my hair while the cicadas hummed outside. I learned early that the world would not be kind to a little black girl with big eyes and a louder imagination than she was supposed to have. I learned to keep my head down, to listen before I spoke, and to swallow words when they rose too quickly. But I also learned the power of watching closely, watching how my mama carried herself with dignity even when people disrespected her, watching how my daddy held his back straight no matter how heavy the iron he lifted, watching how neighbors leaned on each other because we knew the outside world would never lean toward us. Now, before I go any further, let me be clear. This is not a story of pity. This is not about painting myself as a victim. This is about survival, about finding light in corners that were meant to stay dark, about refusing to let shame and silence write the ending for me. I will tell you about pain, yes, but I will also tell you about love, the kind that saves a life when you least expect it. Some of what I'm about to share still feels like it belongs to another lifetime. But when I close my eyes, I can see it all again. The chipped paint on our front steps, the smell of red clay after a rain, the way my mama's hands looked when they were cracked from bleach. These memories live inside me like photographs that never fade. And maybe you're sitting out there tonight, listening to me, wondering if your own story is worth telling. Maybe you've carried secrets so long your back aches under the weight. Maybe you've been told to stay quiet, to be strong, to pretend. If that's you, I hope my voice reaches you where you are. Because if an old woman like me, with her worn-out bones and her trembling hands, can tell the truth out loud, then so can you. This is the story of my life, from a frightened girl who learned to keep secrets, to a woman who found the courage to open every locked door inside her. It is a story about harm and healing, about the people who broke me and the ones who put me back together. It is a story about how a black girl from Alabama, overlooked and underestimated, grew into someone who now dares to speak in front of all of you. So let me begin. My name is Evelyn May Carter, and before I belonged to myself, I belonged to a little square house on 3rd Avenue West, with peeling paint, the color of old mints, and a porch that leaned forward like it was tired of holding its breath. If you've ever driven past a place and felt your chest go tight for no reason you could name, then you know that house of mine. You know the way a door can look like a mouth that only opens to swallow, the way a window can feel like an eye that never blinks. I was a thin-legged child, with braids that never lay flat, and knees always scabbed from running in red clay. Mama called me her quick one because I could dart from sink to stoop in a heartbeat when she needed a dish towel or a handful of clothespins. Daddy called me Little Bit before he stopped calling me anything at all. He was a steel mill man, and when he came home, the smoke from his shirt clung to the kitchen curtains like a prayer that refused to leave. One day he didn't come home. He said he was going to find better work in Memphis. Then he sent a postcard from somewhere past Memphis, and then he stopped sending anything, not even breath. Mama, Ruth Ann, held us together with starch and bleach and boiled greens and the soft humming she carried in her throat after long days scrubbing floors in houses where her name never fit. She'd step onto our porch at night, roll her shoulders back and say, "Evelyn May, hand me that tin of grease. My hands are splitting like dry earth." I would rub that thick, slick balm into her knuckles while the box fan in the window stirred the hot air, and she would close her eyes like maybe the Lord had set a cool hand on her brow. She was small and strong, and the world had taught her to fold herself down to the size of what was allowed. She did it to survive, and she taught me to do the same without meaning to. There was my brother, too, Calvin, 3 years older, and already wearing the shape of a man in his shoulders when he was only 13. He ran errands for Deacon Harlan Pope at the corner store and kept a marble in his pocket for luck. Calvin could make the world laugh when it didn't want to. He could palm a quarter and make it appear behind my ear. "Magic happens when you want it bad enough," he'd say, offering the coin as if it were a secret. "But you gotta keep your head low while you wish." The house smelled like lye soap and hot grease and summer rain trapped under the eaves. The floors were wood rubbed thin by feet that knew their paths. We had a chipped sink that coughed rust and a stove that ran too hot, and Mama kept the pantry lined with jars of beans we had shelled on the back steps. We were not poor in spirit, she liked to say. We were rich in faith and short on everything else. The year I turned 10, a man started coming around, Earl Dupree. He was the kind of tall that made door frames seem smaller, and he wore his hat stubbornly low even indoors, as if he didn't trust the ceiling not to cave in. He laughed too loud and talked like he expected the world to get out of his way. He brought Mama paper bags with chicken backs and day-old bread, and he fixed our radio on a Saturday afternoon without asking for anything except a plate. That's how kindness introduces itself when you need it too much. It doesn't knock. It walks right in and sits at the table. "Mr. Dupree works nights at the garage," Mama told us, smoothing her apron as if that could smooth the rest. "He's decent, folks. Don't be rude." "Evening, Little Bit," Earl would say, his voice oiled and easy. He smelled like menthol cigarettes and motor oil and the kind of cologne that makes a child feel dizzy. "You mind your mama. A good girl keeps quiet and helps." I nodded because I was a good girl. I folded my quiet like laundry and set it on the top shelf where I hoped no one would see it. At first he helped, patched a hole in the porch, brought 2 used fans from the shop, tightened the wobble in our kitchen chair. He got used to being in our house, and then we got used to him being used to it. That's how it goes. What you permit becomes what you expect. He started leaving his hat on Mama's dresser and his boots by our door. He sat in Daddy's chair, the one that never fit anyone else, and made it fit. He leaned in too close when he talked, his breath crawling across my cheek. He put his hand on my shoulder as if he owned my bones. When I stiffened, he chuckled. "Don't be skittish, girl. Ain't no call for all that." There's a way the air turns thin when danger is near. It's like the house itself inhales and forgets how to exhale. A screen door that always squeaked goes silent. The clock ticks louder. The hum of the refrigerator feels like a warning. On those days, Calvin would hover, stepping between me and Earl without making it look like stepping. Mama would rush to stir pots or fold towels that didn't need folding. We orbited around that man the way small planets circle a heavy sun. The pull of him wore us down. The first time he crossed the line between the hallway and my room, I learned that a boundary is only as strong as the person who is willing to defend it. I was 11 and folded into myself like a letter no one should read. I will not lay out the details here. I won't give him the mercy of my words. I will only tell you the facts that matter. It happened. It kept happening, and he told me it was my fault that it happened. He said, "You don't say a thing, not one thing, or I'll make it worse for your mama. You hear me?" I heard him. I heard him like a splinter under the nail that throbs even when your hand is still. Silence took root in me. It grew vines. I learned to make my face a blank page and my voice a pencil too dull to write with. I learned to tuck my body into corners and turn sideways in doorways and make myself smaller than I already was. When Mama asked if I was all right, I smiled with my teeth and said, "Yes, ma'am." Because what else do girls say when their world depends on someone else's temper? School wasn't a refuge. Booker T, Washington Elementary, had hallways that echoed, and girls who laughed in tight little knots, and teachers who smiled kind but didn't have time to look directly at you. I walked a long way to avoid the boys who popped girls' bra straps. I kept my head down and my notebooks neat. I knew the answers, but I learned to leave my hand at my side. The math problems liked me. The words liked me more. On spelling tests, my pencil flowed quietly, a river that made no sound. In the fall, the air over Birmingham smelled like smoke from the mills and like rain if the sky was feeling generous. I would walk past storefronts with hand-painted signs and women in house shoes sweeping steps they had swept the day before and the day before that. Men in work shirts leaned on their cars and eyed the day like it had already disappointed them. On 3rd Avenue West, folks kept to their business because noticing is a kind of trouble. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unhear a cry. So we learned to hear only the cries that belonged to us. Sometimes in the evenings, I sat on the back steps while Mama shelled peas. The moon would hang low and the mosquitoes would buzz foolish, and Mama would say, "Bring me that newspaper, Evelyn. My eyes are tired." She didn't wear glasses then. Pride is a stubborn animal. She would pretend to read and then fold the paper neatly and set it aside. "Your penmanship is pretty," she said once, eyeing my homework. "You should write things people need to hear." I wanted to say that the things people needed to hear were messy and loud and got stuck mid-throat. I wanted to tell her that sometimes my voice felt like a door I couldn't unlock, even with both hands on the knob. I wanted to tell her that I slept with the dresser pushed against my door when I could get away with it, even though it didn't stop anything that mattered. I didn't say any of those things. I said, "Yes, ma'am." Calvin watched me. He had a way of noticing without asking. One afternoon, he slipped that lucky marble into my palm and closed my fingers around it. "For when you need to remember you still got something shiny," he murmured. "Don't let nobody take the light you got." I kept that marble in my pocket so long, the glass warmed with my skin. When Earl's boots thudded on the porch, my hand went straight to it, as if it could turn me invisible. Earl didn't like the church much. Men like him rarely do. The church is a mirror and a megaphone. It won't let you pretend you're smaller than your harm. Mama still took us on Sundays, Mount Olive Missionary Baptist, with the red brick and the steps that felt too big for short legs. Pastor Isaiah Reed preached from a voice that sounded like knotted wood rubbed smooth, and the choir wore robes the color of old hymns. I loved the church the way thirsty grass loves a hose, but it also felt dangerous to feel so open. The same week Earl started staying over, he told Mama, "Girl, you can pray right here at home." And she bowed her head like her neck had forgotten how to hold it up. We didn't go as often after that. By the time I reached 12, My whole body had learned how to keep secrets. Not just my mouth, my shoulders, my walk, even the way I breathed. I could move through a room without sound, like dust settling. That was survival. School became the stage where my silence was performed most clearly. Booker T. Washington Elementary had long, echoing hallways that smelled of chalk and mop water. When the bell rang, the noise was so loud it felt like my skin could crack. Boys shoved each other, lockers slammed shut like doors on tiny cages, and girls whispered in clusters, their laughter sharp as pins. I carried my books tight to my chest, head bent, praying not to be noticed. If someone brushed my arm, I stiffened. If a teacher called my name, my pulse thundered so loud I barely heard the question. I knew the answers. I always knew them. But I had learned that standing out brought eyes, and eyes brought danger. At night, when the house settled into uneasy quiet, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling. The wood above me was stained by years of leaks, dark rings like eyes that had watched too much. The sound of the floor creaking down the hall made my stomach turn to stone. I would clutch Calvin's marble in my hand until its roundness left an imprint in my palm. That little glass ball felt like proof I was still real, still here. Calvin did what he could. He was only a boy himself, but he tried to be a shield. When Earl was around, Calvin stayed close. He'd say, "Come outside, Evelyn, help me with the ball," even when no ball was in sight. We'd stand in the yard, him spinning stories about the big world he swore he'd see one day. "New York City, little bit," he'd say, eyes burning with dreams. "Skyscrapers so high you'll think you touched God." But dreams can't always outrun fists. Calvin grew restless, and restless boys in Birmingham were magnets for trouble. Police didn't need a reason. The color of your skin was enough. More than once, Mama whispered prayers into the dark after hearing news of another boy beaten for walking in the wrong place at the wrong time. She would grip Calvin's arm too tight and say, "Don't you dare leave me, son, don't you dare." He'd nod, but his eyes still searched the horizon. Inside the classroom, I tried to disappear into my notebooks. I wrote words in the margins, tiny poems I never read aloud. If my mouth stays closed, my heart can breathe quiet. If I am small enough, maybe the world won't notice. Those words were my private rebellion, even if no one saw them. One afternoon in 6th grade, Mrs. Lorraine Parker, my history teacher, asked us to read paragraphs out loud. My throat closed before it was my turn. I could hear my pulse in my ears, a heavy drumbeat. When she finally called Evelyn, I really tried, but the words jammed. My tongue felt nailed to the roof of my mouth. The classroom air turned hot, sticky with shame. "Speak up, child," she said. But I couldn't. The other kids giggled and my cheeks burned. Mrs. Parker sighed, shook her head, and moved on. That moment stayed with me like a scar, proof that even in a room full of children, my silence was louder than any voice. At home, I carried that silence into chores. I scrubbed dishes until the water went cold, folded laundry in neat stacks, polished Mama's shoes with ragged cloth. Mama would glance at me sometimes, her face lined with worry. "You're too quiet, Evelyn May. Ain't healthy for a girl to swallow her tongue all the time." I wanted to tell her everything, but when I looked at her tired eyes, her cracked hands from bleach, the weight of survival already pulling her shoulders down, I couldn't. How do you lay your burden on someone already bent under their own? So I stayed quiet, and the silence grew thicker like smoke that never clears. The truth is, silence becomes its own kind of language. It says, "I am here, but I cannot tell you what it cost me." And in that language, I lived my whole adolescence. By the time I turned 13, I believed silence was the only way I could survive. But life has a strange way of putting people in your path when you least expect it. For me, That person was Mrs. Margaret Delgado, the new English teacher at Booker T. Washington. She was a black woman in her 30s, tall and graceful, with hair that she wrapped in bright scarves that made her look like she carried the sun itself on her head. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had weight, like every word knew where it belonged. From the first week she arrived, I noticed she didn't treat us like children to be hushed or ignored. She looked us in the eyes, each one of us, as though she was checking to see if our souls were awake. Most teachers back then didn't waste that kind of attention on black children, especially quiet ones like me. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, she gave us an assignment. Write me a poem, about anything you want. Don't worry about the rhymes, just tell the truth on the paper. The classroom groaned. Some kids scribbled nonsense just to be done. But I sat with my pencil hovering, my chest tightening. The truth? My truth? That was the one thing I never let out. But my hand moved anyway. I wrote about fire and snow, about being small in a house that felt too large, about carrying a voice I couldn't use. The words poured out like water that had been dammed too long. When I finished, I shoved the paper to the bottom of the stack, hoping she wouldn't notice. 2 days later, Mrs. Delgado called my name after class. My stomach dropped. I thought I was in trouble. I walked slowly to her desk, eyes on the floor. "Evelyn May," she said softly. I glanced up. She was holding my poem. Her eyes were wet and her lips trembled like she had swallowed something sharp. "Did you really write this?" "Yes, ma'am." My voice was barely a whisper. She leaned closer. "Child, do you know what you've done here?" I shook my head. "You've taken something heavy and turned it into light. That's not easy. That's rare." Her words struck me harder than any slap ever could. No one had ever called anything about me rare. I didn't know what to say. My silence stretched between us like a rope pulled too tight. She reached out, resting her hand gently on mine. "You don't have to speak now. Just know this. Your voice matters, even if it only lives on paper for a while. Don't let anyone steal that from you." That night I lay awake replaying her words. Your voice matters. The phrase echoed like a hymn. It was the first time in my life that someone saw past the silence and pointed toward a door I didn't even know was there. In the weeks that followed, Mrs. Delgado found small ways to keep me writing. She'd slip me books, Maya Angelou, Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks. Their names like secret passwords into a world bigger than Birmingham. She'd jot notes in the margins. Notice how he turns pain into music, or see how she tells the truth plain and still makes it beautiful. For the first time, I felt like maybe my silence wasn't weakness. Maybe it was waiting for words strong enough to carry the weight of what I'd lived through. Mrs. Delgado never asked me what I was hiding. She didn't push, but she watched me carefully, like she could sense the storm beneath my skin, and in her steady gaze, I began to believe something I never dared before, that maybe, just maybe, my story wasn't meant to stay locked inside forever. After that day with Mrs. Delgado, something inside me shifted. It wasn't loud, like a bell ringing. It was quiet, like a door clicking open in a long hallway where I had always thought every door was locked. I started writing more. At first it was only in the margins of my homework, little lines, phrases that clung to me like burrs on my dress. Then in a cheap blue notebook Mama had bought on sale at Mason's, I began filling whole pages, poems about the sky above Birmingham that looked wide but still felt like a ceiling. Stories about girls who ran through fields and never looked back. Letters to a God I wasn't sure was still listening. Mrs. Delgado encouraged it without making a fuss. One afternoon, she pressed a book into my hands, a slim collection by Langston Hughes. The pages smelled of dust and ink, and the words hummed with rhythm even when I read them silently. "Carry this with you," she said. "When you're afraid, Let these voices remind you you're not the only one. For the first time, I walked the hallways of school with something like armor in my satchel. Not metal, not wood, but words. I still didn't speak much, but I began to test my voice in tiny ways. When Mrs. Delgado asked the class to read out loud, I whispered a single sentence. It shook like a leaf in the wind, but it was mine. She nodded as if I'd spoken an entire speech. When a girl in my class, Charlotte Green, dropped her books, I bent down and said softly, "Here, let me help." She looked surprised that I had a voice at all, then smiled. That small exchange felt like climbing a mountain. At home, I found other small ways. I asked Mama if I could season the beans one night, just to feel the freedom of flavor in my hands. She laughed, tired but pleased, and said, "Don't use too much salt, baby." I started reading Psalms aloud to Calvin before bed, pretending it was just practice. He listened with his hands folded behind his head, nodding like he already knew I was braver than I believed. But courage is never straight. Some nights Earl still came, and my silence returned, heavy as chains. His shadow filled the house, and the words I had found curled back inside me. On those nights, I would press my notebook against my chest like a shield. After he left, I would write furiously in the dark, scribbles only I could decipher. It was Mrs. Delgado who first planted the thought that maybe my silence wasn't just survival. Maybe it was also evidence. One afternoon, she looked me straight in the eyes and said quietly, "Evelyn May, sometimes the truth hurts so bad you think it'll kill you, but keeping it in will kill you slower. If the day ever comes when you're ready to speak it, I will believe you." I didn't answer. I couldn't, but I carried those words with me, tucked in the lining of my chest. They were a promise, even if I wasn't ready to collect on it yet. That spring, the azaleas bloomed bright red in our neighborhood, loud against the soot-gray houses. I remember standing outside our crooked porch, notebook in hand, thinking maybe the world was bigger than 3rd Avenue West. Maybe there was a place where my voice could rise without fear. It was a fragile hope, but it was mine. Hope can be a fragile thing. Sometimes it grows slow, like moss on brick, and sometimes it shatters all at once, like glass tumbling from a high window. For me, it was both. That spring, I had begun to imagine a life beyond our crooked porch. My notebook was thick with words, my heart a little less heavy. But Earl Dupree still came around, still filled the house with his smell of oil and smoke, still leaned over me like a shadow I couldn't outrun. One night when I was 14, it happened again. I won't tell the details. I've carried them long enough. But what matters is this. My brother Calvin came home earlier than expected. He stepped into the hallway, and for the first time, he saw what my silence had been hiding. "Get your hands off my sister!" Calvin's voice cracked like thunder. Earl froze, his face twisted with rage, then shoved past him, muttering threats. The front door slammed so hard the walls shook. My knees gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor. Calvin knelt beside me, his breath ragged. "Evelyn May, why didn't you tell me?" I couldn't answer. The words stuck like stones in my throat. All I could do was cry. Deep, heaving sobs that tore out of me after years of being locked tight. He held me, rocking back and forth, whispering, "I got you. I got you." The next morning, Calvin walked me to school. He didn't speak, just held my hand tighter than he ever had before. When we reached the steps, he said, "You're going to tell Mrs. Delgado, today. I won't let you carry this no more." Inside the classroom, I tried to keep my eyes on my desk, but Mrs. Delgado noticed the bruise on my arm. Her face changed, soft at first, then fierce. When the bell rang, she asked me to stay behind. "Evelyn May, did someone hurt you?" Her voice was low, steady. My hands trembled. For a long time, I couldn't speak. Then like a flood, the words spilled, broken, stuttering, tangled, but true. I told her everything. She listened without flinching. When I finished, she placed both hands on my shoulders and said, "Thank you for trusting me. You did nothing wrong, nothing. Do you hear me?" I nodded, tears streaming. That afternoon, she walked me to the principal's office. The air smelled of floor polish and pencil shavings. My heart hammered as I told the story again, this time to adults with serious faces. One called the authorities, another called Mama at the house. By evening, 2 police officers stood on our porch. Earl was gone, but they took statements, wrote notes in little books, promised to find him. Mama wept, clutching her apron. She looked at me with eyes full of sorrow and shame. "Baby, I didn't know. Lord, forgive me, I didn't see." For the first time, I saw her smallness break. She wasn't just tired or proud. She was crushed. That night I didn't sleep in my own bed. I was taken to a temporary foster home, the Winters family again. The kind folks who had once given me safety after Daddy left. The sheets smelled of lavender. The air was free of fear. For the first time in years, I slept without pushing a dresser against the door. The next days were a blur of questions, forms, and court whispers. Earl disappeared for a while, hiding from the law. But the silence that had bound me for so long was broken. My truth was out in the open, and though it hurt like fresh wounds, it was also the first real breath I'd taken in years. And when I walked into school again, notebook pressed to my chest, Mrs. Delgado met me at the door. She didn't ask if I was all right. She didn't need to. She just said, "You are not alone anymore." For the first time, I believed her. Safety had always felt like something other people owned, like a house you could admire from the road but never step inside. After that night, when the authorities came and Earl disappeared, I found myself carried into a home where safety wasn't just imagined. It was real, and it had a smell, a sound, a weight. The Winters family lived on the east side of Birmingham, in a 1-story brick house with a wide porch and flower boxes that spilled over with petunias. The first night I stayed there, Mrs. Evelyn Winters, a round woman with dark, kind eyes, handed me a plate of cornbread and collard greens and said, "You're welcome here. Eat as much as you need, baby." I hadn't realized how long I'd been eating, like food was rationed. Small bites, quick, like someone might snatch the plate away. That night I ate until my belly ached, and she just smiled, sliding another piece of cornbread onto my plate. Her husband, Mr. Harold, didn't say much, but when he laughed, it rumbled like a drum that steadied the whole house. Their youngest daughter, Laverne, was just a year older than me. She had braids that swung when she walked, and a laugh that filled the kitchen like sunlight. She didn't treat me like I was fragile or strange. She just said, "You want to borrow my hair ribbons?" and handed me a handful of bright colors, as if friendship could start that simple. The room they gave me smelled faintly of lavender. The sheets were clean, tucked tight at the corners. There was a quilt at the end of the bed, handmade, every square a different patch of fabric, denim, floral, checkered. I ran my fingers over the stitches and felt something I hadn't in years, care. Somebody's hands had sewn those pieces together with love. At night I lay awake, waiting for the sound of boots in the hallway, for the creak of a door. But all I heard was the hum of a ceiling fan, and once in a while, the faraway whistle of a train. Slowly, my chest loosened. I began to breathe without fear. The Winters didn't ask questions right away. They didn't press. They gave me chores like everyone else, setting the table, folding towels, sweeping the porch. At first, I thought it was a test, but soon I realized it was something else, belonging. They weren't making space for a guest. They were making space for family. I remember one Sunday morning, Mrs. Winters handed me a white dress, freshly ironed. We go to church every week, she said. You come with us. Mount Olive Missionary Baptist was bigger than our old church, its choir louder, its pews filled to the edges. As the voices rose, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't a shadow. I was one voice among many, and the sound wrapped around me like a quilt of its own. It wasn't just the Winters who offered kindness. My caseworker, Miss Thompson, checked on me often. She was a young black woman with sharp suits and a voice like steel. You are not a problem to be solved, she told me once, looking me square in the eyes. You are a life to be lived. Those words lodged deep in me, and I carried them like a shield. In school, Mrs. Delgado stayed close. She slipped me more books, encouraged me to share my writing, even entered one of my poems in a county-wide contest without telling me. When I won 3rd place, I held the certificate in my hands like it was made of gold. For the first time, I felt proud. But even in safety, healing wasn't simple. I still woke sometimes in a sweat, clutching the quilt, my throat tight. I still froze when a man's footsteps echoed too loud behind me. But I began to trust that those moments would pass, that I was no longer trapped. The Winters' home became the soil where I started to grow roots again. For the first time in years, I thought about the future not with dread, but with a trembling kind of hope. Maybe I could be more than the silence. Maybe I could be the voice. And in that house, surrounded by petunias and quilts, cornbread and hymns, I began to believe it. By the time I turned 17, I had lived long enough to know 2 things: that pain could last a lifetime, and that hope, even small flickering hope, could last longer if you tended it. The Winters family, Mrs. Delgado, and my caseworker, Miss Thompson, had carried me through the darkest part of my youth. But as high school came to a close, the question hung in the air like thick summer heat. What now, Evelyn? Most girls in my neighborhood married young or went straight into housework. College wasn't something we dreamed of. It was something white children across town prepared for. But Mrs. Delgado had other ideas. She called me into her classroom one afternoon, stacks of books leaning like tired towers on her desk. Evelyn May, she said, eyes shining, you need to apply to college. Not just any, you've got to reach for something bigger. I laughed, nervous. Me? College? She didn't smile. Yes, you. I've read your words. I've watched you grow. Don't you dare shrink back now. That night I told Mrs. Winters. She clapped her hands together, her bracelets jingling. Lord have mercy, my baby's going to college, she sang, already planning who to call and what forms to find. And so, with shaky hands, I filled out applications. I didn't have much money, but I had grades, I had words, and I had people who believed in me. That was enough. By spring, a letter arrived. I had been accepted to Tuskegee Institute. I remember sitting on the porch, the letter trembling in my hands, the world suddenly feeling wider than the Birmingham streets I had known. Calvin, older now, working at a mechanic's shop, came by and slapped me on the back. See, little bit? Told you'd touch the sky one day. College was a revelation. For the first time, I was surrounded by black professors, black students, black excellence on every wall. I didn't have to explain why I was there. I didn't have to fight to be seen. I took courses in literature and history, and for the first time, I spoke in class without fear that my voice would betray me. Of course, not every day was easy. I worked in the cafeteria to pay for books. I ate more beans and rice than I care to remember. I stayed up late, tears dripping onto essays when the weight of my past tried to smother me. But every morning, I woke up knowing I was building something. And then there was David Carter. I met him in the library. He was tall, with dark skin, and eyes so gentle they seemed to see past every wall I had ever built. He caught me one evening, asleep at a desk, with a notebook under my cheek. He tapped the table and grinned. Dreaming in poetry? I wanted to snap at him to hide the pages, but something in his smile stopped me. Something like that, I whispered. David became my steady place. He walked me to class when nights felt too heavy. He listened when I spoke of Mama, of Calvin, of Earl. He never rushed me, never pushed. He just held the silence with me until I was ready to break it. By the time we graduated, he had already asked me to marry him. I said yes with a heart both terrified and certain. We married in 1969 in a small church filled with gospel music and cornbread after the service. I wore a borrowed dress, and he wore a suit 2 sizes too big, but we looked at each other as if we owned the world. Our first home was a 1-bedroom apartment with leaky pipes and a window that rattled in the wind. We didn't care. We had each other, and soon we had 2 children, Ruthie and Isaiah. Their laughter filled the rooms, chasing away echoes of the silence I once lived in. Motherhood was not simple. Some nights I cried in the dark, afraid I would pass my brokenness to them. But David would hold me and remind me, "You are giving them what you never had. Safety, love, presence. That's more than enough." With time, I became a teacher, just like Mrs. Delgado. I stood in classrooms full of black children and told them the same words she once told me. "Your voice matters. Don't let anyone steal it." Every time a child's eyes lit up, every time a student dared to raise their hand, I felt a piece of myself heal. But perhaps the greatest healing came from the ordinary. Sunday dinners with fried chicken and collard greens, evenings reading on the porch, braiding Ruthie's hair while Isaiah tapped a beat on the table. It was in these small rituals that I learned I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. Life didn't erase the past. I still carried scars, but I also carried joy, and joy grew stronger with each passing year. Looking back, Chapter 7 of my life was the moment I realized something important. I wasn't the girl in the shadows anymore. I was a woman building a life, brick by brick, with hands that once trembled but now shaped a future. By the time I was in my 40s, I had raised 2 children who could stand tall in a world that often wanted them bent low. Ruthie was bold, her laughter like brass, her mind quick and unafraid. Isaiah was quieter, thoughtful, always asking questions that made adults pause. I watched them grow and knew I had broken the cycle. The silence that once lived in me would not swallow them. But even as I built a safe home, something tugged at me. I could not forget the girl I had been, scared, voiceless, carrying shame that was never hers. I saw her face every time a student lingered after class, eyes down, words caught in their throat. I saw her in the way some children flinched at sudden noises or avoided going home after school. One evening, after grading essays at my kitchen table, I looked at David and said, "I think I need to do more." He raised an eyebrow. "More than teaching, raising 2 kids, and feeding half this neighborhood every Sunday?" I smiled, but my chest tightened. There are children out there who don't have a safe place. I know what that feels like, and I can't keep pretending my classroom is enough. David leaned across the table, his hand covering mine. "Then do it. You've carried the fire long enough. Let it light the way for somebody else." That was the seed. Within months, I started a small after-school circle at the community center. At first, it was just 3 girls and 1 boy, kids who didn't want to go straight home. We sat in a circle on mismatched chairs, and I gave them notebooks. "Write anything," I told them. "A poem, a story, a prayer. It doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to be yours." The first week, pages stayed blank. They looked at me the way I once looked at Mrs. Delgado, wary, guarded, unsure if words could be trusted. I didn't push. I just kept showing up week after week with notebooks, pens, and snacks. Slowly, something shifted. One girl wrote about a mother who never came home sober. A boy scribbled a rap verse about being invisible in his own house. Another wrote her name over and over, as if carving proof that she existed. I listened, I nodded, and I told them the truth. You are not broken. You are not to blame. Your voice matters. The group grew. Word spread. Soon, we had 15 children crammed into that room, pouring themselves onto paper. I called the program Voices Rising. Parents, guardians, even pastors started asking me about it. Some children who had been labeled troublemakers in school became leaders in our circle, guiding younger ones through their first shaky attempts at writing. And it wasn't just writing. We talked about how to recognize abuse, who to call when you felt unsafe, how to build a circle of trust. We brought in a counselor once a month, and Miss Thompson, yes, my old caseworker, now head of a local advocacy office, partnered with us to create a hotline for youth in crisis. There were nights when I came home exhausted, tears streaking my face after hearing stories too close to my own. But David would remind me, you can't save everyone, but you can show them that saving is possible. And oh, how the saving multiplied. I watched children walk into that room with their heads down and leave with their shoulders straighter. I watched poems turn into performances at school assemblies, watched silence transform into laughter and song. Ruthie and Isaiah grew up helping me with the program. Ruthie organized bake sales to raise money for supplies. Isaiah drove kids home after meetings when it was too dark for them to walk alone. My children saw firsthand that healing is not selfish. It ripples outward. Looking back, I realized Chapter 8 of my life wasn't just about helping others. It was about reclaiming the girl I had been. Every time I told a child, "It's not your fault," I was also speaking to that scared little Evelyn May on 3rd Avenue West. And every time their faces lit up with hope, I felt a piece of my own story redeemed. By the time I reached my 60s, my children were grown, my hair had turned the color of cotton, and my body had slowed down enough to remind me daily that time is no fool. But my mind, oh, my mind wandered everywhere, back through the crowded rooms of Voices Rising, back to the classrooms where I saw children bloom, back to that girl I used to be, standing silent in the hallway of Booker T. Washington Elementary, clutching her books like a shield. There is something about age that sharpens memory. You would think the details would fade, but instead they return clearer, heavier, like they have been waiting their turn to speak. I could still see the porch on 3rd Avenue West, paint peeling in long strips. I could still hear Mama humming while she folded laundry, her voice thin but steady. And I could still feel the fear in my chest when Earl Dupree's boots hit the floor. But here's the difference age gave me. When those memories rose up, they no longer swallowed me whole. They sat beside me, like old companions, reminding me of what I had endured and what I had overcome. My scars stopped being wounds and became stories. Sometimes when I was mentoring a young girl in Voices Rising, I would catch myself staring at her face and suddenly see myself, 11 years old, desperate for someone to believe me. And when I told her, "I believe you," it was like healing echoed backward through time. At family gatherings, I would watch Ruthie and Isaiah with their children, my grandchildren, running through the yard with laughter spilling behind them. I'd sit on the porch, quilt across my knees, and whisper to myself, "They will never know that silence. Not in my lifetime. That was my promise, and it was kept." But aging is not just about pride. It is also about reckoning. There were nights when I asked myself questions I still couldn't answer. Why didn't Mama see sooner? Why did Calvin carry so much alone? Why did I live when so many girls I knew did not? Sometimes the answers never came, and that is part of life too, learning to live with mysteries, with holes in the story that no one can fill. In church, I would sit in the front pew, the same girl who once hid in the back, and let the choir's voices wash over me. I would close my eyes, hands folded, and think, Lord, I made it farther than I ever thought I would. And in the quiet of the evenings, when the house was still, I would rock in my chair and reflect. The little girl in me still lived there, but she was no longer alone. She was surrounded by generations of love, by children and grandchildren, by students and survivors who had found their own voices. Looking back, I realized my life was not defined by what was taken from me, but by what I refused to let go of: dignity, hope, and the stubborn will to speak when silence was demanded. At 70, 75, and now 79, I look in the mirror and see every version of myself layered together. The child who trembled, the young woman who dared to dream, the mother who built a home, the teacher who planted words like seeds, the elder who carries memory like a lantern, and all of them whisper the same truth. You are still here. You are still here. I used to believe silence was weakness, that if you didn't scream, if you didn't fight, if you didn't make noise, then you weren't brave enough. That quiet meant giving up. That calm meant defeat. But I know better now. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's survival. Sometimes it's the only thing a woman has left when the world stops listening. For so long, I held everything inside. The shame of being abandoned, the guilt of not being enough, the crushing responsibility of two small lives staring up at me, asking for answers I didn't have. I didn't cry in public. I didn't ask for help. I didn't explain myself, because who was I, if not strong? But now I see it clearly. I wasn't silent because I was weak. I was silent because I was afraid. Afraid that if I spoke the truth about him, about our pain, about how close I came to breaking, no one would stay. That they'd walk away, just like he did. So I carried the silence. Until I didn't. Telling the truth didn't set me free in a dramatic, cinematic way. There was no applause, no rescue. But there was something else. There was peace. There was Lily, leaning into me again without flinching. There was Noah, resting his head on my shoulder without asking where his dad had gone. There was the sound of my own voice, steady and full, speaking without apology. I go for walks now, just around the block. Nothing fancy, but I notice things more. The sound of leaves shifting in the wind, the warmth of the sun on my face, the small nods from neighbors who no longer look at me with pity. Sometimes I think about the version of me who stood in that empty kitchen, scraping together stale bread and courage. I don't resent her. She was doing her best, and her silence carried us here. But I'm not that woman anymore. Now when I speak, I do it with clarity, with purpose. Not to prove anything, but to remind myself I still have a voice, one that matters. This chapter of our life isn't about revenge or pride. It's about truth, about reclaiming identity, about showing my daughter that you can fall apart and still rise stronger, about showing my son that strength doesn't look like control. It looks like love that doesn't leave. And maybe, just maybe, it's about showing myself that I never stopped being whole. That evening, I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one that had seen my worst nights, and opened a new journal. The first page, blank. I wrote, "To the woman who is still holding her breath, you are not broken. You are becoming." I closed the book, not because the story was finished, but because the silence was. Have you ever carried a silence that felt heavier than your own voice? If this story reached you, if you saw pieces of yourself in Elena, don't keep it inside. Leave a comment. Share your truth. Let someone else know they are not alone. And if her journey gave you even a moment of light, consider subscribing. Not just to follow stories like this, but to honor your own, because your voice, however quiet, still matters, always.